I've spent my life believing I am the garbage that no one's going to want to be because her mom's in prison. She doesn't know who her dad is. And now someone's celebrating me saying, I wish I could have your control. There's not a bad food and a good food. There's not a good body or a bad body, but that language is often used.
Kyira Wackett is a licensed mental health therapist and founder of Adversity Rising, specializes in trauma recovery, resilience, and overcoming shame, fear, and anxiety.
Resilience is to believe I am worthy of love, acceptance, and belonging as I am. It doesn't mean I can't want for something different. It doesn't mean I can't want to have a different relationship with food in my body.
And how childhood trauma can lead to the development of this disordered eating.
If we just think sort of trauma on a general perspective, what we know is that sort of the head and the body often detach.
How do you know when someone is developing a poor relationship with food? Because that's really what it comes down to, isn't it? Welcome. I'm so excited to have you guys back today. And today I'm joined by Kyira Wackett. Kyira is a licensed mental health therapist and the founder of Adversity Rising. With over a decade of experience in the mental health field, Kyira specializes in helping individuals overcome fear, shame, and anxiety. But her work focuses really on trauma recovery, resilience, and living authentic. In today's episode, we're going to dive into the complex relationship between disordered eating and childhood trauma. So before we get started, why don't you just share a little bit about your connection to disordered eating and why it's a part of your practice?
Yeah, I think that I was not aware that I struggled with disordered eating for quite a while. And looking back, I realize, and this is definitely something we can break down. Oftentimes, I think people think of disordered eating or eating disorders, and they immediately think, okay, someone's making themselves throw up, someone's not eating anything. What we see is typically sort of the sprinkling beginning effects start much younger. And so what I remember is, as a young child, when everything was going on with my mom, I moved into new homes right around adolescence. I had never had any thoughts prior to that about my body in any way. I don't think, at that point I was totally aware, but I remember noticing my body changing. Now I know that a lot of how my body was changing was a result of my trauma, that there was obviously some adolescent components to it too, but I was constantly struggling with my hunger and fullness. I was holding weight in different ways. I was feeling just like a sense of constant bloating. I was always having GI issues. Again, going back, knowing trauma, we can know that this is more than just puberty. There was something more to it. And at the time, I remember becoming really aware of my body doesn't look like these other people that I'm trying to fit in with. And my body doesn't feel like it fits here. What's wrong with my body? And that was just sort of there. And I think the interesting thing when we think about disordered eating is it often shows up as just a tiny little whisper of, well, maybe you just shouldn't eat that one thing. Or maybe if you change this one little bit, you would feel better. Or if you dress this way, it would feel better. And that started at 10, 11 years old. And that was really like, if we're going to talk disordered eating body image distress, that was so much more dangerous to not be addressed at that time, that then down the road became, eventually seeing, well, what happens if I don't eat? What happens if I throw up? What happens with this? And we'll definitely tie this back to the trauma component more. But I think if we just look at eating disorders and disordered eating and sort of the problem within it is culturally reinforced and celebrated if you're engaging in the behaviors that make your body smaller and make you seem more in control. And so when this really started to come into full swing, I was an adult, I was in college, I wanted to feel like my life wasn't the shadow I was hiding from everyone. And when I lost weight and I got celebrated, I was like, well, who the fuck would ever give this up? This is fantastic. This is amazing. Everybody loves me and wants to be me. And I've spent my life believing I am the garbage that no one's going to want to be because her mom's in prison. She doesn't know who her dad is. She's got all these things. And now someone's celebrating me saying, I wish I could have your control. I wish I was as,
Let's connect that dot, right? Because that's so powerful. How would you explain, and this is going to be a big ask, how do you explain how childhood trauma can lead to the development of this disordered eating?
Well, I think one of the things that's really interesting, and so we could use the specifics of my trauma story, but I think sometimes when we use that, people will then write themselves out of it and not see that that could link to them. So if we just think sort of trauma on a general perspective, what we know is that sort of the head and the body often detach. We are not connected to our body in the same ways anymore. And so whether that is a suppression of our emotions, our physical feelings, it's no longer safe to be in the body. For many people with trauma, especially childhood trauma, they're not aware they're dissociating, but they are dissociating. They're detaching in some way. So when you have this severing of the brain with the body, you're not in communication with it anymore. Now the body becomes this appendage. And then if you sort of layer that at the same time that culturally we're taught that it's a thing that also gets in the way of productivity, those two things come together really well. We're not connected to it. We don't really know how to engage with it. We're also emotionally dysregulated. And so we don't quite we're not achieving those same, like a dopamine hit looks different. We're chasing something different in a different way. Food and the way that we relate to our bodies, I'm not feeling hunger and fullness in the same way. I am seeing my body as likely a problem or a distraction or whatever it is. I also am searching for something in my brain, some sort of regulation, and I don't know what it is. And food is a really great way to get that, particularly for young kids because it's accessible, as opposed to a lot of other different materials or different things like drugs or things like that. Obviously, people use that, but food becomes this weird way of self-soothing. But I really think the key issue is you're getting some hits in your brain, but you are so detached from your body, you don't have sort of the negative ramifications that would often maybe impose a boundary or a barrier. You're just like, well, I'm getting this hit and it feels good, or I have some control and it feels good. And then at least in my case, it was, and now my body's changing in a way that everybody seems to celebrate and like. And that feels even better because I don't even know what my body wants or needs anyways.
It's so interesting. So you talked about the disassociation.
Mm-hmm.
So for people, would you categorize that in the four, trauma responses that would be that freeze adaptation that so many people fall into, right?
Yeah.
So we talk about fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. When we're freezing, we have this ability to, as Kyira said, disconnect, or in a technical term, disassociate.
Mm-hmm.
From ourselves. And what's been really interesting is even though I don't specialize in eating disorders or body image or body dysmorphia, I do see clients that have challenges with their body, their relationship with their body. And what's been interesting to me is clients I've had that prior to working with me maybe have lost a significant amount of weight. Many of them have said to me, I know logically I lost weight. I know because I can see it on the scale, and I know because I'm 5 sizes smaller, and I know all these things, but I still feel, and this is not my language, this is their language, just so people know that, they will say to me, I still feel like a fat person. I know I lost the weight. I do not feel like I've lost the weight. Have you heard this from other people? And what would you speak to that? What would you say?
I mean, I think, so 2 things in what you said. The first thing that I think we also, because you mentioned that fight, flight, freeze component, a big reason I also think that we disconnect from our body is for many of us, we can feel like our body has betrayed us in some way, or our body didn't show up for us in some way. So there's another layer to that also comes into this whole, what's my relationship with my body? So the body becomes sort of an appendage. It's maybe it didn't show up for us. It didn't fight for us. It didn't do something. We have a lot of shame around that. And again, we're sort of disconnected from it. We don't know those main cues. The final layer being most of us as children, regardless of if you went through trauma or not, have been deconditioned to listen to your own body cues. I mean, think about us as adults. If you have to go to the bathroom, but you're in the middle of recording a session, you're going to tell yourself to wait until you finish recording instead of saying, oh, my body's telling me I need to go to the bathroom, or my body's really hungry, but I'm about to go into back-to-back recordings. I'll eat in a few hours. And so all of that's happening at the same time. But again, I think our relationship with our body becomes somewhat dangerous and difficult to access because we don't know what's in there anymore. I think for most people, the disconnect with their body has a lot to do with some of the physical pieces, but usually it's, well, that's where I feel like all the emotions are buried. And if I start to connect with what I'm feeling physically, I'll have to connect with what I'm feeling emotionally. And so what you just described with people being like, okay, sure, the numbers are this, but I see this, or the numbers are whatever.
I feel this.
Yeah, exactly. And genuinely they're looking in the mirror and they're still seeing a fat body or whatever their body is. And my body at the time this happened, I still struggle with this. And now I'm 15 years in recovery, almost 15 years in recovery. I still have days like that where when I am very high, like my cortisol's up, I'm very stressed, overwhelmed, my body image is the first thing to go. I will go from seeing myself in a mirror, within 20 minutes, something could happen and I see a completely different body in the mirror. And it feels really, really real to me. I cannot see my body the way that other people do. And so that does happen. I think the biggest thing is when you are seeing a projection of the world that is based on your core beliefs. It's the same way where you have the same interaction, or you could witness me having an interaction with somebody and I leave and I'm like, oh my gosh, they're so mad at me. They don't like me. I felt like I just really screwed up that conversation. You're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. That seems like a very neutral interaction. Right. That's the same with our bodies. Our body is a projection of our core beliefs and our shame. And if you have these deep, unhealed wounds and repressed emotions that are housed there, your body is going to be this thing that you see as a representation of that, of your laziness, grossness, fatness, the distress associated with your unrepressed or with your repressed emotions, unresolved healing shows up there.
So interesting. And I'm so glad that you described that, because in my head, I was like, what's the neuroscience behind that, right? So kind of rooted in that core belief system. I wanted to address something you were talking about, a body not showing up, and it almost feels like it's a punitive or like a punishment in some way, shape, or form. What I have seen in my practice, not across the board, but in a number of instances, is that the stressful environment that my client might have been in, or the abuse or the aggression or the violence that they were experiencing or witnessing was done so early on in life that when we look at these 4 adaptations or these 4 human responses to stress, like fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, and you're not in a position to fight, and you're not in a position to leave and flee, and maybe you're even pre-verbal, so you can't fawn, and or even if you are verbal, you can't please yourself or appease yourself or talk yourself out of it, that the only option for safety is to leave your body, is to be present, but not be present. Because remember, all of these adaptations are survivals. So if there's a part of your body that feels the threat is greater than your ability to ward off the threat, and the fight's not going to work, and the flee's not going to work, and the appease is not going to work, your body is brilliantly going to say, we're checking out. And I'm going to teach you how to disconnect from yourself or from your body in order, in survival, basically. And it doesn't have to be abuse, aggression, or violence. It could be you're being berated, or maybe you're witnessing something that's terrifying, that's leaving you feeling unsafe or insecure, where again, I don't know how to deal with this big emotion. I'm out.
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
Yeah, I was having a conversation with somebody the other day, and I feel like they, in just a few words, summarized exactly what you're saying, which is the system is designed to protect the system. And I think just like we forget that, and then we impose some idea of I should or shouldn't have done that, instead of recognizing that the system did exactly what it was supposed to do to protect the system. So it's not good or bad. It's a neutral response for protection. And so I think that piece is really key. I'm also, this is sort of a tandem thought, but I think it ties in too, because what you're talking about for many people, these responses and these sort of ways of coping with their pain, with their trauma at such young ages, also think about the messaging with food at that time as well. So one of the things, I mean, I struggled with this. My daughter's almost 5. And I mean, we would constantly have conversations with people around there's no such thing as a good eater. They're not a good kid because they ate this food or didn't eat this food. There's not a bad food and a good food. There's not a good body or a bad body, but that language is often used. So if we're talking about these simultaneous experiences of just every day they're eating and what are they hearing about bodies, while they're also trying to design a way of protecting themselves, that feeds into it too. And so, well, gosh, I better be a good little girl and eat all my food. Or I'm a problem because look at all these people are telling me that I'm a really chubby little kid. So there's these things that come into it too. And then again, you're trying to figure out, well, who do I need to be safe in the world? And this is the performance. That lays a foundation where I think food becomes something we feel like we have to manage rather than fuels us and our body and helps us exist in the world.
Well, it's so interesting because as you're talking, it just gets more complex and more complex because again, we need food to survive. Right. And also food is a part of our daily culture, usually, and I'm going to put in quotes, usually 3 times a day, right? So like how many of us have a memory of sitting at a dinner table and being told you can't get up unless you finish eating, or you must eat what's on your plate, even if you're not hungry, or you must eat something that's making you gag, or you must eat something that you don't like the taste of or the texture of, or whatever it is. In many ways, we were not allowed to have choice when it came to food, number one. The other thing I'm thinking of is we have that in tandem with, at the same time, maybe the same person then using food as a reward, right? So, oh my God, you did something good. Let's go get ice cream. Oh my God, you did something good. Let's do this for you. And, or, oh my God, you're sad. Let me make you something to eat.
Or, and this is something I did not connect to until I got older, things like when I would go get vaccines, I'm very scared of needles and I've had some very triggering experiences. My grandma would say to me, if you don't cry, I'll take you to get ice cream.
No doubt.
And so that would come up for people. If you don't do this, if you can act the way I need you to act in the world to have the performance, so I look like the good parent or the caregiver, whatever, then I will reward that, which then again, deconditions the emotional experience, reinforces suppression, repression, just so I can then get this treat, so I can get that reinforcement. I'm a good little girl. They're happy with me.
And then think about the other environments, which can be very, very cultural, where it's disrespectful if you don't eat. Eat more, eat more, eat more. What do you mean you're not hungry? Of course you're going to eat it. What's wrong with that person that they're not eating? I mean, the food, it's so complicated. So here's a question I have for you. What kind of early signs might someone show if they're developing, I don't even know what you want to call it, an eating disorder, a poor relationship with food? How do you know when someone is developing, I'd like to use the word poor relationship with food, because that's really what it comes down to, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think about like the goal for all of us is basically food and body neutrality. There's been a huge push sort of on the opposite side of body positivity, loving our body, having an amazing relationship with food. That's a great goal. And when we live, especially, for us in the US, in a $60 billion health and wellness industry that their marketing is like top-notch marketing to make everybody feel like shit in their bodies, that's just not an attainable goal right now. And so I often think about if that's the goal, is body and food neutrality, where I see The potential issue is when we move kind of, if we look at that spectrum of like, here's negative 100, the 0 is that neutrality, and then 100 is the super positive. Once we start really veering down and staying down below the 0, because everybody has days. That's normal. Like my daughter at 5 has days where she doesn't feel good. And I'm not going to come in, although my eating disorder therapy background wants to come in, make sure we're having full conversations and she feels okay and all that. But that's normal. There's nothing wrong with that. I think what I tend to pay attention to is what's the trend? What's the data telling us is that overall set point? Every kid, every developing adult, every adult is going to have periods where they feel better or worse with their relationship with food in their bodies. But what's the average? What's the general trend and where are they staying? So when I'm thinking about young people, I spend a lot of time working in intensive outpatient and partial hospitalization programs for kids 12 to 18. What I'm watching for and what we're talking to parents about is a trend. If there's a day that your kid doesn't eat and they're super depressed or they're really stressed about exams or they just hit puberty and they are like, let's think about a child that is born in a female body, biologically female, identifies as non-binary, and now they are developing breasts and fat tissue, it would totally make sense that they're going to have some body image distress because their body looks more feminine. They don't identify as female. So like there's a lot of nuance to it, but again, watching for the trends. So what I start to pay attention to.
When you say trends, do you mean patterns?
Yeah, I think patterns, but I'm also, sometimes I think the behaviors can be so sporadic, you don't necessarily notice it as a pattern. It's just as I start to collect the data, am I trending towards something that doesn't feel as good? So like for some people, an example, it might be consistent. They are consistently not eating their food. Maybe they're coming home and their lunchbox isn't eaten, or they're kind of pushing their food around, not eating at dinner. For some people, you might notice they do that every once in a while, but they might also be starting to play around with over-exercising, or they might also starting to be playing around with a diet pill or a laxative. And so sometimes it isn't necessarily a pattern you can pick up on, but you'll notice there are certain things. Often those behaviors can be hidden pretty well. So what I pay attention to is more the general demeanor and having conversations about their bodies. What is your relationship like with your body? When's the last time you felt neutral about it? How often do you change your clothes before you leave the house? I had a client that used to change her clothes at least 15 times every single day before leaving the house because that disordered eating body image brain was so loud, nothing looked okay. And something that looked okay last night now doesn't because of that fear of being seen in this outfit.
So I kind of want to go back a little bit to the childhood trauma part, because why not? That's like always where I end up. Again, this is not an area of expertise for me, and it's not something that I've ever dealt with personally. So I'm asking a lot of questions that other people might have. You know, in the past, and when I say past, I mean 90s, like I definitely had friends that were in outpatient programs, either inpatient, outpatient, for eating disorders. It would have been very, very different in the 90s and the early 2000s than it is now, I'd like to think. But there was always this underlying understanding that there was a control at play. And I'm wondering if that's accurate, number one. And number two, is the general simplicity of the concept that when we experience adversity during our developmental years that leave us feeling like we don't matter or that we're not enough, is there a part of this, you know, set of behaviors or condition or whatever you want to call it that are trying to mitigate that feeling of not feeling enough or not feeling in control of your own life?
So I think two things with what you just said. One of the issues, and we saw this, I mean, I saw it in school as well, the number of, and it's mostly cisgender teenage girls. It was not necessarily biologically males or gender non-binary children. We are seeing more of a shift in that. Traditionally speaking, it was thought that eating disorders were a white cisgender female issue. So what we saw for treatment was very specific to white women.
Right.
What we know about treatment in general, there's some absolutely beautiful programs and treatment methodology for eating disorders. And you've seen this on the trauma side as well. Oftentimes where I feel like we run into issues is we're treating the symptom, which is the eating disorder or the disorder.
Right. And not the core.
Exactly. And so with that, the control piece always makes the back of my neck cringe, because I think there is a valid statement to talk about control, but I think we anchor it on the wrong thing. So we've anchored it of like, they're just trying to control their food. They're trying to control what they look like. And there's this vanity piece.
See, I don't think it's that.
And that's where often it gets used against people. And then the treatment becomes just eat. Let's just get them eating again, instead of going, what is happening? And so when I think about control, and I can speak to my clients, but I also think just like using my own experiences as an example, it wasn't, I just want to control something in my life because everything feels out of control. It was, my brain is consistently giving me, it's talking at me all the time, and everything it says is negative. And most things I feel like I don't have any power or control to do anything about. And when it's telling me, you shouldn't eat this, you're fat, you're disgusting, you're this, that's something I can actually respond to. And I start to feel a little bit more at ease. I'm in the shame spiral. I don't realize that it is this obsessive thought with a behavioral pattern that's just going to feed back into itself. But on a base level, I'll feel a sense of calm because I did something that now I feel better. I am taking control of these feelings and these thoughts that are overwhelming me, that I don't know what to do with those. So I do think there's a control piece. And I think there's this element of, you kind of mentioned this idea of the narrative. It is that. But as soon as we introduce control and eating disorders, I think too often the general public, and I've seen this with colleagues, they go back to just simply control with food. Not, I'm trying to control my flooding of thoughts, my dysregulated nervous system, and the distress that I don't know how to do anything with. And this is one thing that I get a quick hit back and it feels like it works. It doesn't, but in the short term, it feels like it does. That's where I feel like it comes in.
Well, that's when we're talking about adaptive versus maladaptive, right? Like so many of these things are adaptive in the moment and then become maladaptive because they're hindering us. They're not helping. Yeah. I have 3 things. I'm going to let you pick a card. I've got 3 things that came to my mind as you were talking. Okay. Yep. So one is, I don't know if you've ever seen this survive, thrive spiral.
No.
And it's so cool. It is a shame spiral that's in alignment with internal family systems. Ooh. And it is developed by a woman named Ruth Culver. It's Culver. And anybody can Google Ruth Culver survive, thrive spiral. And she illustrates, I think she actually created this during COVID. She illustrates a little bit of what you just described, which was when we're rooted in self, right? So this is the IFS piece of it. When we're rooted in self, when we're in alignment, when we're grounded, we're in this unshakable, unwavering state of I can. Hold on. No. For those listening, my dog just tried walking into my studio. That's a hard no. So we're in that I can state. Mm-hmm. And we have a sense of resilience, right? Anything can come our way. We're in a calm, collected, optimal state to be able to deal with it. Right. When we are leveling into this zone of threat, we get into this fight or flight. Mm-hmm. We get into the sympathetic nervous system. We're getting into this ventral vagal state, where we're in this hyper-vigilant, hyper-aroused zone, and we've now gone from I can to I must. And I must means something feels like in threat. I must take action. Yeah. Right? Now, when we're in that must take action, we've got these protectors in internal family systems that are known as managers. Mm-hmm. That are supposed to manage whatever emotions coming up when we get into this must zone. But if we cannot make that work, we then pop into this I can't zone. Mm-hmm. So we've gone from I can, I must, I can't.
Yep.
When we're in that I can't zone, like I can no longer deal, right? We hear people say that all the time. I just can't even. We're now in the third card that I want to pull up, this idea of firefighters in this protective zone of internal family systems, right? I also want to address that all of this is a normal response to usually an abnormal circumstance, right? So you had talked about that before. So what's your, which do you want to talk about? Do we want to talk about firefighters and this body dysmorphia and this challenged eating and this negative relationship with food, from a firefighter standpoint in internal family systems? Or do we talk about this, spiral of I can, I must, I can't?
I definitely think we can get into the spiral piece through the firefighters. The firefighter piece is honestly, so when I was getting treatment, this was a big reason I became an eating disorder therapist, was when I was struggling with my eating disorder and I went to go see several different therapists. I mean, again, you have seen this with people that have found you. You saw this in your own experience where people can say they're trauma informed. That doesn't mean they are. And I was having a really hard time finding someone. Like I had one person tell me that they thought because I had had oral surgery when I was 10 that I developed an oral fixation and that's why I developed an eating disorder. And I was like, how about the, decade plus of trauma that we're just kind of casually casting to the side? And so when I really considered what I wanted to do, I ended up taking an extra year in my master's program to make sure that I had the supervision that they give you during that, because it's so much more intensive, so that I wasn't going into treatment in something that I didn't yet have in recovery, to make sure I wasn't doing harm to someone else, because unfortunately we've seen that. All that being said, I still in my master's program was only briefly mentioned IFS and didn't find it until I was in like my 4th or 5th year of practicing outside of my master's program, and was like, where the fuck was this? Because that would have said that. Like that was all I needed, was for someone to give me that piece of information. Because the thing that nobody got, and this is where I was really good in the therapy room, was I could relate to the fact that when somebody was asked to give up their eating disorder, I don't know if you've seen the movie If, that's all about the imaginary friends that just came out like a year ago. It's like asking them to give up their best friend, their if. And so you would not understand it. And it is because that is the role, that is the part that the eating disorder has played. And it has been a consistent protector that has been with you. And now you're asking me to just completely abandon this part that has been here, when where the fuck were all of you? Because this was here. And so that, to me, I can feel it. Like I can still feel I have heat. Like I have like a dribble of sweat that like wants to come out, because and some of that was just the information wasn't as available. We've said that before.
And this is what makes me crazy. Like when I first learned internal family systems and I was getting trained in parts work and polyvagal work and all of that, I was like, how and why are all therapeutic schoolings, whether you're getting a master's in social work or licensed professional counselor, or you're getting a psychotherapy degree, whatever it is, why the fuck are they not just utilizing internal family systems as the model? It makes the most sense. It relates to everybody, and everybody in every fucking session does it without knowing that they're doing it. There's a part of me that wants to do this. There's a part of me that doesn't want to do this. There's a part of me that believes this, but then there's a part of me that believes that. It's the most natural thing. Thank you, Dick Schwartz, for doing all of the hard work to develop this therapeutic model. So if people don't know what we're talking about, it's a therapeutic model known as internal family systems. Some people call it IFS. It's been around for 40 years, but it really hasn't gotten a groundswell, probably, I don't know. I want to say like in the last 5 years, maybe. But the idea is that we're all multimodal. We're all made of a lot of different parts. We're born with a self energy. You know when you're rooted in that self energy because you feel calm, cool, collected. You're resourced. you feel unshakable, unwavering. You use that language. I feel so connected to myself. I feel in alignment with myself. I feel like I'm in flow. When we are presented with stress and or we've had prolonged chronic stress that brought up emotions that we did not know how to process, we will fragment from that self and create parts of ourselves in survival of these big emotions and these big experiences that we don't know how to process. And those parts tend to get bigger and bolder and louder than our self-energy, and sometimes maybe shadows out the self-energy or whatever. Here's the thing. We all know these parts. There's people-pleasing parts, inner critic parts, caretaking parts. There's hundreds. I can't mention them all. But those particular parts, these kinds of manager parts, are proactive. It's like, what can I do to protect Kyira or what can I do to protect Stacy from hitting that emotion that they don't know how to process or that fear that they don't know how to process? How do I have to show up proactively? If that part doesn't do its job, a firefighter will come in and be like, you suck. You didn't do your job well. And so now they're feeling the big feel and they don't know how to do it. So now I'm going to squash it out. We're going to soothe it. We're going to distract it at any cost. Now, to what you were saying before, it's benevolent. It's, in theory, adaptive. I'm helping. To your point with the if, I am your ride or die BFF. Nobody knows this better than me. I've got your back. Don't worry about it. I'll take over. And I was listening to, and this is not political, and I'm not saying that this is a person that I veer for at all, but I was listening to a really interesting interview with RFK Jr. because I was curious, because I didn't know, because I don't pay attention to him, that he had been a heroin addict for like 14 years. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I want to hear about that story. Because to me, that's all rooted in trauma, right? The guy's had a super traumatic life. So I was super curious. And he said in the interview, it was the only thing in my life I couldn't will the right way. And I would wake up in the morning and I would make this decision with myself. See what he's saying? With myself. Not today. Today's the day. I'm not going to do heroin again. He said, and I was determined up until about 3:55. And then at 4:00, this other piece of me would show up and just take over.
Well, and
I was like, it was fascinating for me to hear him talk about it that way. He didn't reference parts work or internal family systems, but think about this with disordered eating. I'm sure many people feel this. Today is going to be the day. I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to binge. I don't want to purge. I don't want to restrict myself, whatever the issue is.
Right.
I want to see myself the way everybody else sees myself. We're on the path. And then all of a sudden you feel completely sidelined by this other part of yourself and you have no control.
And I do not say this.
You feel like you don't have any control.
Right.
Let me state it that way.
Right. And I don't. So my mom, who struggled with crack cocaine addiction and a myriad of other substances, and then me, who struggled with an eating disorder. At the time I was diagnosed, it was called an eating disorder, not otherwise specified. Now I would have sort of oscillated back and forth between the two types of anorexia nervosa. And the idea there is, for anybody listening that's interested, it basically means they used to assume that if you had anorexia, you only restricted and overexercised. Now they see that people with anorexia also binge and purge and do these other behaviors. And so one of the things that she and I talked a lot about, because you're right, everything about that I agree with. And you can design a life where heroin doesn't have to be a part of it. And the really difficult thing is most of us have a fucked up relationship with food in our bodies. Most everybody does. And now we've decided you have too much of a fucked up relationship, so you have to figure out how to be better. But you have to have your substance every day. But don't fall into that. And that part...
Because you need it to survive.
Yes. hey, we want you to connect with your body because that's healing, but also you hate your body, but you got to do it every day and you better do it better than everybody else around you. Typically, your therapist is probably drinking a Diet Coke, not eating and listening to their body's hunger and fullness cues, but now you have an eating disorder, so you better make sure that you're eating every few hours, that you are listening to that you're following intuitive eating. And the stakes get so high. And we dismiss the reality that you're asking somebody, it'd be like telling my mom, like, what if you just like did a little bit of crack today? But like, don't do too much. Just do a little bit and then don't feel bad afterwards and don't let the voice take over. And so that's the one part that I think often gets oversimplified is we're now also asking somebody to figure out how to have a relationship with someone. And I hear this from clients all the time, and I have felt this too. Then recovery often means, so I can never want to lose weight again. I can never dislike my body again. I can never want to diet or change my body. Can I exercise? Is that a problem? How do I know if it's too much? Is it okay to want to do, like I have a friend right now who's, I think at this point, 7-8 years in recovery from their eating disorder and is doing a lot of fitness work and is like, is it a bad thing to want to have some body recomposition and work on my fitness? Am I asking for another eating disorder? And so the other thing is you have to sit in a state of questioning yourself for the rest of your life. And it gets easier. Like I can now like have the thought and go, yeah, I'm probably fine. It's okay if today I'm just having a shitty body image day. Like I got my period. I feel overwhelmed and bloated. I had a really hard conversation with my mom and I'm super proud of how it went, but also like it took a lot out of me. Give yourself a day. But for the rest of my life, I've got to watch it just a little bit more. And I think that part isn't often talked about. And that feels really lonely for people in eating disorder recovery because they're with their quote unquote drug of choice every day in a body they have to somehow figure out how to exist with, that they have been conditioned to see as the problem. And the rest of the world has normalized that they don't have to. They get to diet and hate their body, and that's okay, but you don't. Which creates an othering that's often missed in the overall conversation.
That's exactly the word that was in my head. I was like, and now they're other. Yes. I want to back up a little bit more to the IFS piece, just because I want people who this is speaking to understand this model, because I think it could be so effective. So from your point of view, what can you share as far as the idea of utilizing a therapeutic model like internal family systems for disordered eating?
So that was interesting for me to really think about. So obviously, I mean, for many people that have been listening to your show for a long time, they've heard you talk about all these different modalities. And so the predominant form of treatment for eating disorders was cognitive behavioral therapy. And there was something called CBT-E, which was a specific modality tailored to eating disorders. Over time, we started to see a lot more work on acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, and then dialectical behavioral therapy. And I do think DBT has a big place because what we're looking at is reactivity. And oftentimes, some of those sort of impulse control components, there's some really beautiful language that DBT can offer to help with some of that regulation. But I have found, and when I'm working with anybody now, whether they have simply a disordered relationship, which I would argue most all of us have in some way, shape, or form on the spectrum with food in their bodies, or a full-blown eating disorder, is we talk about that. And we talk about the parts piece. And we talk about, and I used to say this, and gosh, the pushback I would get from parents when I would talk in a family therapy session about, we need to invite the eating disorder to the table. You're treating it like the black sheep of the family. You need to give it a chair. And that was a big part for the client, that teenager, as I work with adults now, to help them realize, how could you, and I'm sure you have this conversation with people as well, like, how could you have expected you developed any different way of functioning? Like your body, again, the system is designed to protect the system. And now we're taking this part of you that's helped protect you when you were in a state of survival, and we're demonizing it. That feels unfair. That feels like it's unacceptable. And so I think having that, for me, starting with the individual client, and then oftentimes, and they do this part in eating disorder work a lot, where they'll have you give your eating disorder a name. And oftentimes you do some letter writing to it. And that really is some IFS work. It's just not labeled that way. Sure. And so a big thing they'll do is like a goodbye letter to your eating disorder. And so we'll just talk about what if you became pen pals for a little bit. And the big reason we'll do that is, can we separate it as a part of you, but not all of you? When we can do that, we can start to see, okay, so now, like I still think about this interview that Elizabeth Gilbert gave years ago when she talked about her fear and how she had to invite her fear into the room. And I don't know her backstory. I don't know if she has a major trauma story. I know that she, like many people, has fear and anxiety. And she would talk about when it would show up, inviting it into the arena and saying, hey, right now, I'm just writing. I'm just sitting here brainstorming. Like, I don't need you now, but I might need you at a different point. And that really is the integration piece that we talk about with parts work. And I think that part, if we can do that of, gosh, how amazing that your body was able to keep you so safe and that your eating disorder was really there for you at a time you needed it.
And that's what I was kind of thinking as you were saying it. Like when I'm working with my clients on parts work, you know, like today, right before you and I were here to record, I had a session with a client and she had two really, really, really present parts. One is fear and one was like a negative chatter. And even though I knew in my head what the logical thing would be, obviously I'm not going to say it. So we were at a point where I had gotten her to visualize the fear piece, where it was in and around her body, how she would give it some attributes, some details, some descriptors. I asked her to do the same thing with her self energy. And I asked her to see if she could find some space between the two. So she could feel and see it's not all of me, it's a part of me. And then as we did this work and we were giving that part of her, which was the fear, more of a voice. And I went through a whole dialogue of what its role and function and purpose and intention was for her. And she could hear it. I said to her, if your self-energy could dialogue directly with this fear part, what would it want to say? And she said, I guess I would want to say thank you. And that's what I was feeling for her. I was hoping she would come to that. You know, you can't really direct that. She goes, I guess I can see how and why it showed up when it did. You know, for her, she's in her 60s. She's 9 years old. And she said, to the point of what we were talking about earlier, I just don't know how to let it go because it's always been with me. And I said, well, what would it look like if we just gave it a different role? You know, what was its value to you? How could it show up a little bit differently? Would it be willing to just take a smaller space in your system so you could call on it and be more led by you being able to call on it versus it running the show all the time? So in that respect, how do you deal with that in this kind of line of work?
Yeah. I mean, I think similar to what you're describing, the first thing I'll often do if someone is, once they get to that position of creating some space between them and their eating disorder voice, is start to figure out where, so mine was always a young female presentation, probably because that's the time that I developed my own eating disorder. So I use the pronouns she, her when I describe mine. And so I'll think about, when does she show up the most? Well, when I'd pay attention to that, there were some patterns in the circumstances I would have. More commonly, it was the different roles and relationships that I would engage in. So you start to do just some curiosity, like some mapping. Gosh, where does she like to go with you? Where is she coming along for the ride? Doesn't seem like she comes with you when you do this thing. Like, for example, when I'm painting, she never came when I was painting. She wasn't there for that. She was just chilling. But if I went to go visit my family, man, was she driving the bus.
Oh, yeah.
So then you go back and you go, okay, so where does she like to come along? And then you get curious. Okay, what role was she playing there? And for many of us, and we know this in our trauma work, it's realizing that's when we're in those states of activation. And so that protector comes out. The difference is, you know, like with fear, we can say, well, what if we give it a different role? I often think about the eating disorder is really, if we're thinking about negative self-talk, particularly around body image and changing the body and our relationship with food, it's a shame-ridden storyline. And so there isn't There are some people that are like, I think shame can be a really healthy thing because it does this and this. Often I call bullshit on that. But what I do think it can be helpful if you reframe it is, so she still shows up for me. Now when she shows up, she's turning on a light switch that says, hey, there's something going on here. And you are still doing that dismissal thing that you do, that I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. And so I'm starting to feel like you're going to need me to show up. So, I mean, like I talk very bluntly to myself, like I need you to get your shit together and listen to me when I'm telling you there's something very real that you're not addressing. And so it becomes more that, and that's how I think it can be helpful. I can't let her in fully. I do have to have, it's like relationships with people in my family. I can still have a relationship, but that distance is much greater. And I go back to that sort of boundaries piece of like, boundaries are the distance. I can love you and me at whatever that, I forget exactly how it goes. I'm sure you know that quote, but it's, I can really appreciate her and use her to my advantage at a safe distance. And then she still feels seen. She still has a role.
Valuable.
Yep. But she's not coming in the house. We've got like the Campbell's soup cans in a string and she's a few houses down. I can hear her, but she's not coming in anymore.
It's a good analogy.
And that shifts it. So that's often where I'll get to. And then, but it is noticing like, seems like you weren't picking up the soup can. She's at the door now. Why is she at the door? Okay, because you've been like, no, I'm fine. And that for most of us is the pattern that if we can start to recognize it, we go, because you spent your life telling yourself you were fine, which is why she came to be in the first place. And that helps with the healing.
All right. So as we wrap this up, I can only imagine that this conversation will have resonated with one person that is listening. That is always the goal. Let's talk about some practical advice. Okay. So for those that are currently struggling with what we're talking about today, what are some practical steps that they can take to start addressing it?
I think honestly, the first thing for any of us is to typically when we start to make a list of, yep, this is a problem, I have it, we do just that. We label it as a problem rather than this is something I'm experiencing or struggling with and I want to get curious about it. So I think the first step I would invite for people to take is to notice if you resonated with some of these things and try to make some space to be curious about them. What is it that you resonated with? What are we talking about here that really hit you? Is there a part of you that's been playing this role? Where did she or he or they come from? And just allowing it to be there. And I think sometimes even just being able to say, oh, this is something that I experience, and then just letting it sit neutrally can be really helpful. So I think that would be part one. The second thing I think about is to bring a little bit of contextual awareness. And so when we're talking about body image, when we're talking about food, I know we're recording this in December, which is when everybody's going to go to all of their family events. And then January 1st is going to hit and everyone's like, I need to lose weight. I need to do this. I need to change my diet. I need to do this. One of the biggest things I think that gets confused is, and that's maybe where we're going to tie in your survive, thrive spiral piece that you talked about, is this. It isn't, I can change my relationship with food and my body if I want to. It's, I have to. And then you start the new year or you start some shame-driven time period with, I have to do this. I must do this. Perfection seeking. And then you can't because no one's perfect. And then you fall into that trap. And so I think just noticing maybe your patterns with this in the past and inviting some curiosity to say, gosh, the world is really defined by the need to believe I've got a problem and I've got to fix it. That is capitalism at its core that's going to keep me feeling like I have to chase success and spend money to get it. And so how do I just start to figure out what feels good to me? What role is this playing? And again, I guess maybe the thing I'm inviting people in general is just curiosity. What would this look like? And what if you just tried on the idea of, I don't have to? Because the ultimate goal in healing, when we're talking about eating disorder work, and ultimately what we're talking about is shame resilience, is to believe I am worthy of love, acceptance, and belonging as I am. It doesn't mean I can't want for something different. It doesn't mean I can't want to experience healing on a different level or have a different relationship with food in my body, but I'm going to stop withholding love for myself until I get there, because that's the shame that comes from these internalized biases and stories and trauma and all of that. And so really bringing curiosity, I think, to the table and allowing that into the space and just percolating on those pieces and noticing where you find judgment and asking yourself whose voice you hear when you hear that judgment. Because typically it's not us,
Love that.
it's someone else.
That's right. That's right. If people want to know more about the kind of work that you do, Kyira, what's a good way for them to start?
Yeah, I think the best spot is my website. So adversityrising.com. And then you can either email me directly, you can check out some of the free resources I have, my podcast, my YouTube channel, all of those pieces, and just see what other programs that I do, really focused again on shame resilience as a whole and how we can talk about integration of all of these different pain points, opportunities, and places that you want to go.
Thank you so much, Kyira, for sharing your invaluable insights on the relationship between eating disorders and childhood trauma. It's your expertise and compassion that's going to offer hope and practical guidance for those facing these challenges. If you're listening and want to learn more about Kyira's work and her access to her resources, visit Adversity Rising. And if you found today's episode helpful, please subscribe, leave a review, share it with anyone who might benefit from this conversation. Until next time, take care and remember, healing is possible.